Hello everyone, I wish you a wonderful day. Today, we're going to explore the moment Mrs Huyen quietly shields Diep and Jame, giving them a safe place to breathe when everything feels trapped. If you enjoy the story, don't forget to subscribe so you won't miss the next episodes. The kind of mourning, older hearts love is not loud. It's the sound of a lid being lifted from a pot, the soft hiss of steam, a small spoon tapping a bowl like a steady metronome, telling the world, we are still here. Diep stood in the doorway of Mrs Huyen's home with her hands wrapped around the strap of a simple bag. She had packed light, because when life is heavy, you learn to carry only what you must. Nai, 4, almost 5, held Diep's fingers tightly, her little palm warm and sticky from the breakfast roll she'd been eating in the car. She looked around with curious eyes, careful eyes, like a child who's learned that new places can be kind, or they can be sharp. Jame stood slightly behind them, not pushing forward, not taking over, just present, the way a man stands when he's used to fighting, but he's trying, really trying, to stop turning every room into a battlefield. Mrs Huyen opened the door before they even knocked twice. She didn't gasp. She didn't ask too many questions. She didn't act surprised, even though her eyes softened the moment she saw Nai. "Come in," she said, voice calm. "Your shoes can stay by the mat. The floor is warm." It was such a small sentence, but it landed like medicine. Inside, the house smelled like ginger and rice. The kind of scent that doesn't demand you to explain yourself. It only says, eat first, breathe second, talk later. Diep's throat tightened. She nodded, but her face betrayed her. Her eyes had that shine that appears when someone has been strong for too long. Mrs Huyen noticed. Of course she noticed. She took Diep's bag gently, as if it weighed more than cloth and a few clothes, as if it carried a year of fear. "You can sit," Mrs Huyen said. "I made congee. It's plain, but it's warm." Jame's jaw flexed. His pride wanted to refuse. His old habit wanted to say, "We're fine. We don't need help." But he looked at Diep. He looked at Nai, and something inside him surrendered. "Thank you," he said simply. Mrs Huyen didn't smile like she had won. She smiled like she had waited a long time to hear her son speak like that. They sat at the kitchen table that was not big, not fancy, but steady. There were 3 bowls ready, and a smaller one for Nai with a little spoon already placed on the right side. Mrs Huyen remembered details like that. The kind of woman who notices how a child holds a spoon and how a mother hides trembling hands under the table. Nai swung her legs on the chair and leaned close to Diep. "Uncle Jame sits here," Nai declared, patting the seat beside her like she owned the world. Jame blinked. His face softened in a way Diep didn't see often lately, like a man letting his guard down in front of a child who doesn't know how to hurt him. He sat beside Nai, careful and gentle, like she was a fragile gift. Diep watched them. Her chest felt full, and then it cracked. Not because she was unhappy, because she was. Sometimes joy is what breaks you, when you haven't had permission to feel it in months. Tears slipped down Diep's cheek, quiet, unannounced, almost embarrassed. Jame reached for a tissue without making a scene and placed it near her hand. He didn't ask, "Why are you crying?" He didn't say, "Don't cry." He just gave her the space to be human. Mrs Huyen didn't interrupt either. She simply poured warm tea, lightly sweet, lightly herbal, and placed the cup near Diep like a small shield. "Drink," she said. "It helps the chest loosen." Diep took a sip. It was warm, Not the kind of warmth that burns, the kind that stays. For the first time in a long time, the air didn't feel like it had teeth. After breakfast, Mrs Huyen clapped her hands once, softly. "Nai," she said, "do you like drawing?" Nai's eyes widened. "Yes." Mrs Huyen pulled out paper and a little box of crayons from a drawer, as if she had been saving them for the right child. "You can draw in the living room," she told her, "but no crayon on the wall. The wall is innocent." Nai giggled. That giggle was small, but it filled the house like sunlight. Then Mrs Huyen turned to Diep and lowered her voice. "You go lie down," she said. 20 minutes. No arguing." Diep started to protest. Habit, guilt, the instinct of a mother who believes rest is a luxury. But Mrs Huyen's gaze didn't move. "You've been carrying a storm," she said. Even storms need to stop." James stood there, caught between love and guilt. He wanted to say, "I should have protected her better," but he knew words couldn't fix what exhaustion had stolen. So he did something different. He leaned toward Diep and said, "Go rest. I'll stay." Diep stared at him. Then she nodded, slow. In the guest room, the bed was made neatly. A folded blanket sat at the foot like a quiet promise. On the side table was a small bowl of peeled orange segments, already prepared, already waiting. Diep sat on the edge of the bed and suddenly felt the weight of being cared for. She pressed her palm to her chest as if to keep it from breaking open. In the living room, James sat on the floor with Nai, helping her pick crayons. "What color is the sky?" he asked. Nai pointed. "Blue, but sometimes purple." "Purple sky," James repeated, smiling. "That's a smart sky." Nai leaned closer. "Uncle James, you stay with us, okay?" It was a child's question, but it hit like a vow. James' throat tightened. He looked toward the hallway, toward the room where Diep was finally resting. "I'm trying," he said softly, honest. "I'm trying to stay." Ni seemed satisfied with trying. She returned to her drawing, tongue sticking out in concentration. Mrs Huyen watched them from the kitchen doorway, holding a dish towel. For a moment, her face looked older than usual, not from age, but from memory. Then, quietly, she asked Jame, "Do you remember the first time you learned what fear feels like?" Jame froze. His eyes didn't answer, but his shoulders did. Mrs Huyen walked closer and sat in the chair across from him, not above him, with him. "I remember," she said. "You were 7. You spilled soup on the carpet." James' mouth twitched like he wanted to laugh and couldn't. "Your father's voice filled the house." Mrs Huyen continued, still calm, still careful. "Not just loud, cold." Ni kept drawing. She didn't understand the words, and that was good. Children shouldn't carry adult scars. James' fingers tightened around a crayon. Mrs Huyen's voice softened. "You learned early that love could come with conditions, that mistakes could cost you peace." Diep, in the hallway, stood quietly at the edge, having woken up sooner than she meant to. She didn't step in. She just listened. Because some truths are not meant to be argued with. They are meant to be understood. Mrs Huyen looked at her son like a mother reading a book she once wrote with her tears. "That's why you become hard," she said, "because you believe softness is dangerous." James swallowed. "I don't want to be hard," he admitted, barely audible. But when he didn't say the name. He didn't have to. Mrs Huyen nodded, as if finishing his sentence in her heart. "When your father pressures you," she said, "your body remembers being small. So you fight, like you're trying to survive." Diep felt her eyes sting again. This was the first climax. Not loud, not explosive, but deep, because she finally saw the root of something she had misread. She had thought Jame's stubbornness was pride, but it was protection, not just for her, for the child he used to be. Diep stepped forward slowly, careful not to scare the moment away. "Mrs. Huyen," she whispered, "thank you for telling me." Mrs. Huyen looked at Diep and reached for her hand. "I'm telling you," she said, "because I don't want your love to drown in confusion. If you don't understand the wound, you'll blame the person bleeding." Diep nodded, tears falling again. This time not from stress, but from clarity. James stared at the floor like a man who had just seen his own reflection in a window and didn't know what to do with it. Mrs. Huyen stood up and moved to the kitchen. "I made soup," she said, almost brisk, like she didn't want emotions to sit too long. "It's simple chicken soup. It won't solve your problems, but it will help your bodies remember comfort." She returned with 3 bowls and placed them on the table. Then she did the second healing detail, something so small it felt old-fashioned. She brought a warm towel, folded neatly, and handed it to Diep. "Here," she said, "for your hands. They're cold." Diep held the towel and felt herself exhale. A warm towel, a bowl of soup, a child coloring quietly. Sometimes that's what healing looks like when you're older. Not fireworks, just peace you can touch. After lunch, Mrs. Huyen took Nee outside to a small park nearby. Not a big trip, not a complicated plan, just a walk. Nye skipped beside her, holding Mrs. Huyen's hand, pointing at birds. "Do birds pray?" Nee asked suddenly. Mrs. Huyen smiled. "Maybe they do. Maybe singing is their prayer." Nye thought about that. Then she said, "I like praying. It makes Mommy cry." Mrs. Huyen's smile faded for a second. Then she squeezed Nye's hand gently. "Your Mommy cries because she loves," Mrs. Huyen said, "and because she's tired. Both can be true." Back at home, Diep sat on the couch with a blanket around her shoulders, and James sat beside her, close but not crowding her. In the quiet, he finally spoke. "I'm sorry," he said. Diep looked at him. "For what part?" James stared at his hands. "For the part where I kept trying to be strong, and forgot that strong can also mean gentle." Diep swallowed. Her voice came out soft. "I don't need you to be perfect," she said. "I need you to be here." James nodded like he was learning a new language. "I'm here," he said. The afternoon light shifted. Shadows grew long. The house stayed calm. Then Mrs. Huyen returned with Nee, who was holding a small paper bag proudly. "I got a cookie," Nee announced. Diep smiled. "You did?" Nee nodded. "Grandma Huyen said it's okay." Diep paused. "Grandma Huyen?" Mrs. Huyen's eyes flicked away, but her lips curved. "It's just a name," she said, pretending it wasn't huge. Diep's heart clenched again, because in one simple word, the house had chosen her. Evening came. Mrs. Huyen lit a small candle near the window, not for decoration, for quiet. She gathered them for a short prayer, simple, clear, not dramatic. "Thank you for today," she said, "for food, for health, for another chance." Diep's hands trembled slightly as she held Nye close. James' eyes stayed lowered, but his breathing slowed. After the prayer, Mrs. Huyen turned to Diep and Jame. "There's something I need to do," she said. Jame looked up, alert. Mrs. Huyen picked up her phone. Diep's heartbeat quickened. "Do what?" Mrs. Huyen's voice stayed steady, but her eyes sharpened with a strength Diep hadn't seen yet. "I'm going to speak to your father," she said to Jame. "I'm going to ask for a meeting." James' face tightened. "Mom, Mrs. Huyen raised one hand, gentle but final. "No," she said. "You've been standing between him and your life for too long." James swallowed hard. He won't listen. Mrs. Huyen looked at him with a sadness that had aged into wisdom. "He may not listen," she said, "but he will hear me." Diep's lips parted. Fear tried to rise. Mrs. Huyen turned to Diep and her expression softened again. "This is the second climax," she said quietly. "I'm not asking you to fight him. I'm asking you to stop fighting alone." Then she said the line that changed the temperature in the room. "If he wants to break you," Mrs. Huyen said, "he has to step over me first." Diep's eyes widened. James' throat tightened. It wasn't loud. It wasn't a threat. It was a mother drawing a line the way mothers do. Not with anger, but with love. Mrs. Huyen pressed call. The phone rang once, twice, no one spoke. Even Nai went quiet, sensing the weight without understanding it. Then, someone answered. Mrs. Huyen's voice stayed calm, controlled, soft but unmovable. "We need to meet," she said. "Not tomorrow, soon." A pause. Mrs. Huyen's eyes flicked toward the window, as if she could see the past out there like a shadow. "Yes," she continued, "it's about our son, and about the peace you keep taking from him." She listened, her face unreadable. Then she said, "I'm not negotiating. I'm informing you." And she ended the call. The room felt like it had just taken a deep breath. James stared at his mother like he had never seen her before. Diep's hands covered her mouth. "Mrs. Huyen," she whispered. Mrs. Huyen turned toward them and exhaled slowly. "I don't know what he'll do," she admitted. "But tonight, you will sleep." Diep nodded, tears returning. And as they prepared for bed, as Nee curled up under a blanket and demanded that Jame read one page of a children's book, just one page, Diep looked at the house around her. It felt like shelter. It felt like hope. But hope is fragile. Later that night, when the house finally went quiet, James' phone buzzed once on the table. He looked at the screen. No name. No number saved. Only a message. "Don't get comfortable." James' face went still. Diep, half awake, sat up. "What is it?" Jame didn't answer right away. He looked at her, at the woman who had been surviving too long, and he chose not to throw fear into her hands. He simply said, "It's nothing. Go back to sleep." But his eyes didn't believe his own words. Outside, the street was quiet. Inside, the house held its breath, because tomorrow might demand a price for today's peace. And somewhere in the distance, a power that didn't like being challenged had just been reminded. Mrs. Huyen was no longer silent.
Xem đưa bé Nhi đến nhà bé Huyền để thở sau chuỗi ngày bị dồn ép. Không hỏi dồn, bà Huyền lặng lẽ nấu cháo, rót trà, chuẩn bị giấy bút cho Nhi và bắt Diệp nghỉ ngơi. Trong không khí ấm áp, Diệp nhận ra không phải ai trong gia đình Jame cũng lạnh lùng. Bà Huyền kể về một mảnh quá khứ khiến Diệp hiểu vì sao Jame luôn cứng trước cha. Nỗi sợ từ tuổi thơ và thói quen tự vệ. Bữa súp gà, khăn ấm và lời cầu nguyện khiến căn nhà dịu lại. Cao chào đến khi bà Huyền gọi hẹn gặp Mr. Hoang. Muốn phá chúng nó phải bước qua tôi. Đêm đó Jame nhận tin nhắn lạ. Đừng yên tâm quá sớm.